At 7:42 on the morning of August 17, 1968, Specialist 4th Class David Brennan crouched at the tree line of Firebase Cunningham in I Corps, Vietnam, and heard the words every soldier dreaded. "You have got point today." 23 years old. Farm kid from outside Des Moines, Iowa. 4 months in country. The platoon leader's map showed a route through triple canopy jungle near the Laotian border. 20 kilometers out, search for North Vietnamese supply caches, 20 kilometers back. Brennan had walked point twice before. Both times he found nothing and returned alive. The Army rotation system meant today was his turn again. Spread the risk across the platoon. Share the burden. Treat all soldiers as brothers in the green hell that did not care about fairness. What Brennan did not know was that walking point meant having the highest casualty rate of any infantry position in Vietnam. 27% of all American deaths came from booby traps and mines. The weapons point men were sent ahead to find with their own bodies. 60 kilometers to the east that same morning, Navy SEAL Chief Petty Officer James Watson was preparing for his 47th combat mission of his second Vietnam tour. Call sign Patches. 31 years old. Founding member of the United States Navy SEALs, former Underwater Demolition Team 21 Frogman. Watson had accumulated 16 combat decorations including 4 Bronze Stars with Combat V. He would walk point today as he had walked point for nearly 3 years of Vietnam service. Leading a 6-man team on a reconnaissance patrol along a river system where Viet Cong intelligence cells operated. Watson's philosophy was simple and absolute. The best soldiers walk point, not the newest. Let the most experienced lead. In SEAL teams, expertise determined position, not rotation. They put their most aware, most lethal operator on point to maximize the team's chance of returning alive. 200 kilometers south, 20-year-old Lance Corporal Miguel Santos from Sacramento, California, was being voluntold to walk point for his Marine Rifle Company sweep through suspected enemy territory. Santos had been in country 9 months. He had developed what his squad leader called the instinct. An unexplainable ability to sense danger before it materialized. The Marines operated differently from both Army and Navy. They used instinct, rotation, and sometimes punishment detail to determine who walked ahead of the column. Santos had volunteered 3 times in the past month. Not because he wanted the job. Because he had watched 2 men who did not have the instinct get torn apart by booby traps. Better him than someone who could not read the jungle. Nobody wanted the job at first. Walking point meant being the sacrificial probe. The human tripwire sent ahead to find what was waiting in the green darkness. Point men walked 25 to 50 meters ahead of the main column. Far enough that an ambush or mine would not kill the entire patrol. Close enough that the point man might survive if the jungle erupted in violence. They moved at 2 or 3 miles per hour through terrain that fought every step. Wait a minute vines that grabbed uniforms. Roots that twisted ankles. Ground that could hide punji pits with bamboo spikes dipped in excrement to guarantee infection even if the fall did not kill. The point man's eyes never stopped moving. Ground ahead. Vegetation to the sides. Tree branches overhead where snipers waited. Back to the ground. Every discolored patch of earth could be a pressure plate. Every vine across the trail could be a trip wire connected to a grenade or mortar shell buried in the dirt. The statistics were clear even if command never announced them officially. 58,148 Americans died in Vietnam. 153,329 were wounded badly enough to require hospitalization. The average age of the dead was 23.1 years old. Small arms fire killed 31.8%. Booby traps including mines and fragmentation grenades killed 27.4%. The point man tested the ground for everyone behind him. If he lived, the patrol continued. If he died, the patrol knew where the danger was. A Marine major wrote in 1970 that at present, the finest mine and booby trap detector in the Marine Corps is an alert and observant point man. Metal detectors had failed spectacularly. In April 1969, the 9th Infantry Division area reported a detection rate of 1.6% using metal detectors. The Viet Cong had learned to use cement to case their explosives. Technology could not replace trained human awareness. Visual detection by soldiers who had survived enough patrols to learn what wrong looked like achieved nearly 90% effectiveness. The human eye trained through experience. The human brain processing patterns accumulated through dozens of patrols. Learning to read the jungle's deceptions. But learning required surviving long enough to accumulate the patterns. Brennan moved forward that August morning carrying his M16 set to full automatic. Selector switch under his thumb. 20-round magazine loaded and ready. He carried less equipment than the men behind him. No rucksack. Minimal ammunition. Just rifle and basic load. Speed and silence mattered more than firepower when you were the probe. The jungle near the Laotian border was triple canopy. So dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. So thick that the platoon moved single file along animal trails because cutting through vegetation was impossible. His platoon leader had briefed him before they left the firebase. If something moves to your front, you shoot it and worry about consequences later. This is a free fire zone. No friendlies out there except us. 25 meters ahead of the column. 50 meters. The men behind him disappeared into the green. Brennan was alone now in a practical sense even though 30 soldiers followed. The M16 felt light in his hands. Too light for the responsibility it carried. His eyes scanned the trail ahead. Broken branch at knee height. Natural or man-made. Discolored earth to the left. Erosion or recently disturbed soil covering a mine. Everything was a question with deadly answers. Watson moved differently that same morning. 3 years of combat had refined his movement to an art form. He used terrain, cover, and concealment instinctively. Flowing through the jungle like water finding the path of least resistance. His SEAL team inserted by helicopter at dawn. Dropped into a landing zone 4 kilometers from their target area. They would patrol to the river. Establish an observation position. Document enemy movement. Extract after 48 hours. The mission required no contact if possible. Pure reconnaissance. Gathering intelligence on Viet Cong supply routes and personnel concentrations. Watson's job was to get his team to the objective unseen, unheard, alive. The difference between Watson's approach and Brennan's came down to philosophy and training. Brennan had received basic infantry instruction at Fort Benning, Georgia. 13 weeks of weapons familiarization, squad tactics, physical conditioning. Then 2 weeks of Vietnam-specific training covering booby traps and jungle warfare before deployment. He learned to walk point through experience. Patrol after patrol. Watching what worked and what got men killed. Watson had spent years in the teams. Constantly training. Constantly refining skills that most soldiers learned once and hoped they remembered. SEAL teams trained for everything. Underwater demolition. Parachute insertion. Close quarters combat. Long-range reconnaissance. They cross-trained until every man could perform every job. When Watson walked point, he carried the accumulated knowledge of hundreds of practice missions and dozens of combat operations. Santos walked point for his Marine Company patrol with a different kind of awareness. Something his squad leader called instinct but Santos thought of as accumulated pattern recognition. After 9 months, he had seen enough booby traps to recognize the subtle signs. Trip wires were not perfectly horizontal. They sagged slightly in the middle. Punji pit covers used fresh vegetation that looked greener than surrounding foliage. Viet Cong often placed mines near natural choke points. Stream crossings. Fallen trees that forced a detour. Narrow sections of trail where soldiers bunched together. He had learned to listen for what was not there. Birds singing meant normalcy. Birds silent meant something had disturbed the jungle's rhythm. Possibly enemy soldiers waiting in ambush. Possibly his own patrol's approach. Possibly nothing. The trick was reading which silence meant death. The Marine Company moved through terrain that shifted from jungle to rice paddies to abandoned villages. More varied than the monotonous green hell of the I-Corps highlands where Brennan patrolled. Santos had the added complication of potentially hostile civilians. Children who smiled and waved in the morning might guide Viet Cong ambushes by nightfall. Old women working rice paddies might mark American patrol routes for later mine placement. Everyone was a potential threat. No one could be fully trusted. The confusion of counterinsurgency warfare made the point man's job infinitely more complex than simple enemy identification. By mid-morning, Brennan had walked point for 3 hours. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the relative cool of the jungle canopy. His hands ached from gripping the M16. His eyes burned from constant scanning. Every 15 minutes, he signaled a halt and the patrol froze while he listened. The birdwatching technique. Listening for silence. When jungle birds stopped singing, when monkeys quit their chatter, when the normal background noise disappeared, danger was near. The absence of sound became the most important sound. Nature had its own early warning system. Animals went silent when predators approached. In Vietnam, American soldiers were simultaneously predator and prey. The jungle's silence could mean they were approaching an enemy position or an enemy was approaching them. At 11:21 that morning, Brennan's world compressed to a single moment. He saw a discolored patch of earth ahead. Roughly circular. About 18 inches in diameter. Could be nothing. Could be death. He raised his fist. The signal to halt. The column behind him froze. He studied the patch. The earth around it showed slight displacement. As if someone had dug and replaced the soil. The vegetation looked slightly wilted. Not enough to be obvious but enough to be wrong. He had been trained that 90% of mines found in Vietnam were detected visually, not with metal detectors. The Viet Cong had learned to use cement casings for their explosives after discovering that American metal detectors were standard issue. Brennan marked the spot with a stick. Moved the patrol around it in a wide arc, continued forward. Behind him, the designated combat engineer would deal with the mine. Carefully excavate. Document. Destroy it. Brennan's job was to keep moving. Keep scanning. Keep the patrol advancing toward the objective. One mine found. How many missed? The thought was constant pressure in his mind. Watson's patrol moved through different terrain but faced identical dangers. The SEAL team operated in a free-fire zone where anything moving could be engaged without permission. Their small size meant they relied on stealth and expertise rather than overwhelming firepower. 6 men instead of platoons or companies. Watson had learned that walking point required a specific mental state. A zone of awareness where conscious thought and instinct merged. He did not think about each step. He flowed through the terrain. Reading it continuously. Processing information faster than conscious analysis allowed. Years of training created automatic responses. His eyes registered details his brain cataloged and compared against patterns. Broken vegetation here. Disturbed earth there. The way shadows fell wrong near that tree line. All input. All processed. All stored for instant recall. The SEAL philosophy of putting the best soldiers on point saved lives but required accepting that expertise developed through survival. You could not train someone to Watson's level in a classroom. Combat taught lessons that no instructor could convey. The Viet Cong learned and adapted. After Watson's 5th confirmed kill on his first tour, enemy snipers adapted their tactics. They stopped moving during daylight after American point men demonstrated the ability to detect and eliminate them at distance. The war became a continuous evolution of tactic and counter-tactic. Watson's survival depended on staying ahead of enemy adaptation. Santos's instinct saved his squad 3 hours into the patrol. They were crossing an abandoned village, moving between burned-out hutches with collapsed roofs and walls pockmarked from previous firefights. Everything looked normal. The kind of ghost village they had seen dozens of times. But something felt wrong. Santos could not identify what triggered his unease. The shadows fell correctly. No obvious signs of recent activity. Birds were singing. A good sign. But his gut screamed danger. He raised his fist. Halt. The company behind him stopped. His squad leader moved forward. Crouched beside him. What have you got? Santos shook his head. Do not know, Sergeant. Something is wrong. The squad leader trusted him enough to take it seriously. They had learned that when Santos felt something, they listened. The squad leader called up the Kit Carson scout, a former Viet Cong soldier who had defected and now worked with American forces. The scout studied the village, moved forward slowly, then pointed at the ground near the central hutch. Trip wire, nearly invisible, stretched across the path at ankle height. Following the wire led to a daisy chain of mortar shells. 682mm rounds wired together with enough explosive force to kill everyone in the lead platoon. The scout carefully disarmed the trap while Santos and his squad provided security. 45 minutes of careful work. Wire by wire. Connection by connection. The Viet Cong would have detonated the trap when the bulk of the company entered the kill zone, maximizing casualties. Santos's instinct saved potentially 30 lives that afternoon. His squad leader put him in for a commendation. Santos did not want recognition. He wanted to survive his tour and go home to Sacramento. Walking Point was how he increased those odds. By putting his developed awareness between his brothers and the hidden death waiting in the green. The mental state required for point work changed men permanently. Soldiers described entering the zone. A heightened consciousness where time slowed. Senses amplified. Awareness expanded beyond normal human capacity. Brennan felt it after his 4th month. Every sense became preternaturally sharp. He could hear individual leaves rustling 50 meters away. His peripheral vision expanded until he seemed to see in almost 360 degrees. His muscles stayed permanently tense, ready to drop or fire or sprint in microseconds. The rifle felt like an extension of his body rather than a separate tool. But the zone came with a cost. Brennan could not turn it off. At the firebase between patrols, his eyes continued scanning. He checked corners reflexively. Sudden sounds made him grab for a weapon that was not there. Sleep became nearly impossible. His mind remained alert even when his body desperately needed rest. Other soldiers talked about the same experience. The point man's awareness became a prison they could not escape even in supposedly safe areas. Watson managed the mental strain differently because of SEAL training and team culture. The teams prepared operators for extended high-stress operations through realistic training scenarios that pushed physical and mental limits. Watson learned to compartmentalize. Full awareness during missions. Deliberate decompression afterward. The small team size helped. 6 men who trained together constantly. Who trusted each other absolutely. Who understood the psychological demands of the work. They debriefed after every mission. Talking through decisions and close calls. Processing the experience together rather than alone. The difference between SEAL operations and standard infantry patrols was not just tactical. It was psychological support built into the unit structure. The Marine company Santos patrolled with provided different support. Marines embraced a culture of aggressive toughness that treated fear as weakness and adaptation as strength. Santos did not talk about the zone with anyone. He internalized the experience. Processed it alone. Showed up for the next patrol ready to walk point again. The Marine philosophy was simple. Overcome. Adapt. Continue mission. Psychological processing was for after the war, if ever. Santos learned to function in a permanent state of controlled hypervigilance, trusting his instinct because his life and his squad's lives depended on it. By 1400 hours, Brennan's patrol reached their objective. A suspected North Vietnamese army supply cache in a valley 3 kilometers from the Laotian border. They found nothing. The cache had been moved, or the intelligence was wrong, or they were searching the wrong valley. Happened constantly. Patrols went out. Found nothing. Returned to base. The lack of contact was better than walking into an ambush, but it meant the risk and stress of walking point produced no tangible results. Just miles covered. Ground tested. Danger navigated. Brennan would walk point again tomorrow or the next day when the rotation came around. The burden was shared across the platoon. Everyone took their turn. Everyone survived or did not based on chance, awareness, and the enemy's choice of where to place the next mine. Watson's SEAL team completed their reconnaissance mission without enemy contact. The ideal outcome for a recon patrol. They observed Viet Somme River traffic, documented routes and personnel, radioed intelligence to headquarters, extracted by helicopter after 48 hours. Watson had walked point through territory that could have held a dozen ambushes. His awareness, experience, and the team's expertise meant they moved through hostile terrain like ghosts. Present but unseen. Observing but unobserved. Watson would walk point on the next mission and the mission after that. In 3 Vietnam tours, he accumulated 16 combat decorations and survived because the SEAL philosophy kept their best operators in the positions that mattered most. Santos's company patrol continued through the afternoon, eventually reaching their objective without further incident. The booby trap he had detected was the only significant contact. By Marine standards, a successful patrol. By Santos's internal accounting, another day survived through instinct and awareness. He would walk point again within the week. Not because of rotation but because his squad leader recognized his ability and the pragmatic Marine philosophy said use what works. Santos did not want to be special. He wanted to be average, anonymous, safe. But the instinct he had developed made him valuable. And value in combat meant being used. The long-term impact of walking point would not become clear until decades later. Medical research 50 years after the war documented the psychological cost with scientific precision. 9% of heavily combat-exposed Vietnam veterans still suffered full post-traumatic stress disorder in 2020. Another 15.5% experienced subthreshold post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms that did not meet full diagnostic criteria but still disrupted daily life. 28% of these veterans were diagnosed with heart disease. Combat exposure doubling their risk compared to veterans with minimal exposure. The physical manifestation of psychological stress, measured in arterial plaque and cardiac events. Veterans who walked point carried specific burdens. The hypervigilance required for survival in Vietnam never fully shut off. 50 years later, men who had been 20-year-old point men were 70-year-old civilians who still checked corners in grocery stores. Still cataloged exits in restaurants. Still startled at sudden sounds. Their spouses described them as paranoid or unable to relax. Their children grew up with fathers who seemed perpetually on guard. Even at family dinners and birthday parties. The zone they had entered to survive combat became a permanent state of awareness they could not escape. Sleep disruption plagued many veterans. Nightmares of walking point through endless jungle. Searching for mines they could never find. Dreams of tripped wires they spotted too late. The terror of that frozen moment when the ground erupted and you did not know if you would live or die. These dreams continued for decades. Robbing sleep and rest. Keeping the war alive in minds that desperately wanted peace. Some veterans developed elaborate coping mechanisms. They avoided crowds where they could not track everyone's movement. They positioned themselves in rooms to maintain visual awareness of all entry points. They kept weapons nearby, just in case. Even though the war ended 40 years ago, the muscle memory of readiness never faded. The automatic scanning, the constant evaluation of threats, the rehearsal of responses, all continued long after the last patrol ended. One veteran said it plainly 50 years after his service. "I never go anywhere without scanning. I still, 50 years later, check corners in stores." The hypervigilance that kept him alive at 23 became the prison that defined him at 73. The three branches' different philosophies produced different long-term outcomes. Army veterans who had rotated through the point position carried the psychological burden of knowing their turn would come again. That eventually chance would determine their survival. The shared burden model meant everyone experienced the stress but intermittently. Some handled it well. Others did not. The randomness of who developed lasting psychological problems bore little relation to how many times they had walked point or how close they had come to death. SEAL veterans like Watson benefited from the team structure and ongoing connection to teammates after service. The teams maintained relationships, created support networks, provided continued purpose through veteran organizations and reunions. Watson's accumulated decorations validated his service and expertise. He had walked point by choice, confident in his training and ability. The agency mattered psychologically. Choosing the risk rather than having it assigned created a different mental framework for processing the experience. Marine veterans occupied a middle ground. The Marine culture of toughness and adaptation meant many internalized their experiences and rarely discussed the psychological impact. Santos returned to Sacramento after his 13-month tour. Got a job in construction. Married. Raised kids. Appeared to successfully reintegrate into civilian life. But his wife noticed his constant vigilance. His kids learned not to surprise him. His friends understood that he preferred sitting with his back to walls. The instinct that saved his squad in Vietnam never turned off at home. The detection methods that kept point men alive in Vietnam developed through brutal experience. Metal detectors failed because the Viet Cong adapted. A 1969 study in the 9th Infantry Division area showed metal detectors found only 1.6% of mines. Technology could not replace trained human awareness. The Marine Corps acknowledged this reality officially in a 1970 report. At present, the finest mine and booby trap detector in the Marine Corps is an alert and observant point man. The human eye trained through survival achieved 90% detection rates. The human brain processing patterns accumulated through dozens of patrols learned to read the jungle's deceptions. But learning required surviving. The casualty rates for point men remained classified officially, but veterans knew the truth through lived experience. Someone in every platoon got hit walking point. Maybe not killed but hit. Wounded badly enough to be medevaced. Losing legs to mines. Taking shrapnel from booby-trapped grenades. Stepping into punji pits that destroyed knees and ankles. The wounded were replaced by new soldiers who learned the job the same way. Through patrols that either ended safely or did not. The enemy adapted constantly. After American forces learned to spot trip wires, the Viet Cong buried command-detonated mines that required no wire. A hidden observer simply waited until the point man or main column reached the kill zone and triggered the explosion remotely. After soldiers learned to recognize disturbed earth, enemy sappers began placing mines weeks or months before they intended to use them, allowing vegetation to naturally recover and soil to settle. The war became an endless chess match of adaptation and counteradaptation, with point men as the pieces most frequently sacrificed. Some soldiers volunteered repeatedly to walk point despite the danger. They developed confidence in their awareness and preferred trusting their own skills rather than hoping the soldier on rotation had equivalent ability. Platoon leaders learned to identify these volunteers and often allowed them to walk point more frequently than rotation demanded. Better to use soldiers who had the instinct and wanted the job than force it on someone who would freeze at the critical moment. But command mistrusted soldiers who seemed too eager. Aggression was valuable, but recklessness got everyone killed. The best point men walked the line between confidence and caution. Between awareness and paranoia. Between moving forward and knowing when to halt. If you want to understand what these men sacrificed, you need to understand that walking point was not just a job. It was a psychological transformation that could not be undone. These soldiers entered a zone of awareness that kept them alive in Vietnam but haunted them for 50 years afterward. They learned to read dangers that most people never see. To hear silences that most people never notice. To trust instincts that most people never develop. And that learning came at a cost that medical research is only now beginning to fully document. 9% still have full post-traumatic stress disorder 50 years later. 15.5% have symptoms that disrupt their daily lives even if they do not meet full diagnostic criteria. 28% have heart disease directly linked to the stress they carried walking 25 meters ahead of their brothers. Searching for mines with their own bodies. Testing the ground so others could follow safely. The birdwatching technique became such an ingrained behavior that veterans continued using it decades later. They noticed when birds stopped singing in parks. They registered changes in ambient sound that civilians never perceived. This awareness occasionally proved useful in civilian life but mostly served as a constant reminder of skills learned in service of survival in a war that ended before they were 30 years old. Brennan walked point 7 more times before his tour ended. He found 2 more mines. Avoided 3 ambushes. Lost 1 man from his platoon to a booby trap that the point man that day missed. Brennan was not walking point when it happened. The rotation had moved to someone else. The guilt of survival. The knowledge that if it had been his day, maybe he would have seen the trip wire. Maybe not. The randomness of combat made judgment impossible but did not stop the questions. Watson completed 3 full Vietnam tours. 47 missions on his second tour alone. He walked point on missions that took him deep into enemy territory. Through rivers patrolled by Viet Cong. Through jungles where North Vietnamese regulars operated. Through villages where any civilian could be an informant. He survived because the SEAL philosophy put expertise first. Because his team trusted him absolutely. Because 3 years of combat had refined his instincts to a level that civilian life could never dull. Santos walked point 23 times in his 13-month tour. His instinct saved his squad 6 times that he knew about. Probably more that he never discovered because the danger he sensed and avoided never materialized into visible threat. He went home to Sacramento with a Purple Heart he never talked about and a combat action ribbon he kept in a drawer. The instinct that kept him alive never left. 50 years later, he still could not shake the feeling that danger waited around corners that held nothing but everyday life. These men deserve to be remembered. Not as heroes necessarily. Not as victims certainly. But as soldiers who did the job no one else wanted. Who walked ahead of their brothers into the green darkness. Who tested the ground with their own bodies. Who developed awareness that saved lives at the cost of their own peace. Who came home carrying psychological burdens that medical science is only now beginning to understand and measure. The point man walked 25 to 50 meters ahead. Alone in the practical sense even when surrounded by comrades. Eyes scanning. Ears listening for silence. Mind processing 1,000 details per minute. Looking for the discolored earth. The sagging trip wire. The too green vegetation. The absence of bird song. The wrongness that could not be defined but could be felt. Living in a zone of heightened awareness that never fully turned off. 50 years later, they still scan corners. Still check exits. Still startle at sudden sounds. Still carry the war in their bodies and minds. The point man's burden did not end when the patrol returned to base. It followed them home. Into their marriages. Into their families. Into their sleep. A permanent state of readiness for dangers that no longer exist but feel eternally present. If this story moved you, these men deserve your remembrance. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia. Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure these point men do not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered. And you are helping make that happen.